Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. So I don't need to tell this crowd about the amount of research that's gone on at Chaco Canyon. And people tell me they're sick of hearing about Chaco, but here we go. There's still little agreement on some fundamental issues, such as socio-political organization, the economic system, etc. But I think there's a line of evidence that has not been given adequate attention, and those are the myths, stories, and oral traditions told about Chaco Canyon by the Pueblo people and the Navajo people, as recorded by anthropologists over the last 100 years. Now, many of you may be familiar with the Navajo story of the Great Gambler, which tells of a powerful, dangerous man who comes up from the south to the Chaco region, begins to challenge all the people to gambling matches, and he wins progressively, first their possessions, their corn, then their families, and eventually the people themselves as slaves, whom he forces to pay off their gambling debts by constructing the great houses. Eventually the people are freed by a divinely aided hero because the gods are unhappy with the hubris of the gambler, who himself is semi-divine, the son of the sun. Now, also from the Puebloan side, the Carisan Pueblos specifically talking about White House, a location on the migration path that is associated by Native people and archaeologists with Chaco Canyon. One of the things that went wrong at White House, as documented in these stories, is excessive gambling. I quote a woman from Laguna who describes the story saying, "The men became obsessed and began to gamble away everything, neglecting their ritual duties and losing all possessions of value." So I think that these stories have been overlooked for a few reasons, one of which is we have the assumption that myths do not equal history. But of course they do. Native people know their own history, and while there's metaphorical elements and moral instruction tied in, they're also reporting on historical events. And this has been documented and argued very well recently by people like Peter Whiteley, Roger Echo Hawk, and others. Now, the other objection I can already hear coming from the crowd is the Navajo have nothing to do with Bonito-era Chaco. Well, let's think about the fact that 2/3 of Navajo clans claim ancestral Puebloan origin. There's been plenty of intermarriage over the years, Navajo people taking refuge with the Pueblos during times of Spanish colonial persecution, the sharing of agriculture, color, directional symbolism, as Linda just mentioned. And the Navajo people were living on that landscape, and we think of Keith Basso, stories sit in places, so they may have curated that story that took place in that area. That idea was first put forward by Steve Lexon. So there's a lot of questions that could arise from a consideration of these stories, and I chose the simplest one. Was gambling happening at Chaco, and was it a big deal? So we're not just myth scholars, but we're archaeologists. So I traveled to the American Museum of Natural History and the Smithsonian Institution, and I looked at every artifact excavated from Pueblo Bonito and other sites in Chaco that had been cataloged as a gaming piece by Pepper and Judd. Well, these things have sat in museum drawers and gone unpublished for many, many years, but there's 428 of them. These include, the most common type are kick sticks, cylindrical sticks about this long that look like what's used at Zuni for the kick stick race, which is a ceremonial event I'll describe in a moment. Many, many dice, and most interestingly are shinny sticks, or essentially golf clubs. They're these artifacts that get glossed in the literature as so-called ceremonial sticks. Some of them probably, but you look at type 3, comes down like this and there's a club on the end. And Pepper himself made that connection, and you look at the Zuni golf clubs, you look at shinny sticks from across North America, they're type 3 Chaco ceremonial sticks. Furthermore, all of these pieces were concentrated in the northern rooms where the high status burials were and many of the important Mesoamerican imports, etc. So there's the archaeological piece. But I think these things have been overlooked as gambling pieces because of our cultural bias, that gambling is a recreational leisure activity, which, when we consider Pueblo ethnography, we find out it certainly was and probably is still not. So among the Pueblos ethnographically, dice games were used for rain divination and war divination. In fact, there's an account from Zuni of a so-called dry team and a wet team playing each other, and the winner of that determined where the fields were planted that year, in riskier locations or more assured locations. The games were played to bring rain, and from Acoma it's reported that an entire medicine society was organized just to play the dice game because it was found to be so effective in bringing rain. Where was the dice game played? In kivas. We talk about the number of kivas at Chaco and Chaco's ceremonial powers holding everybody together, but we don't say what's happening in the kivas. I think it could be these divinatory gambling games. And there were huge bets made. Cushing describes at Zuni at a kickstick race, quote, vessels, silver ornaments, necklaces, embroideries, and symbols representing horses, cattle, and sheep amassed in 2 great piles in the plaza, with the winning team awarded these, quote, mountains of gifts from the god. In fact, flowing water itself, flowing down arroyos and hillsides, is conceptually linked to the Kachinas kicking along their kicksticks. Flowing water and kicksticks are conceptually linked. Finally, the world, the landscape itself, is thought of as the gaming board of the gods, and our human lives as the gods gambling. So in a Zuni folktale, it's written that the landscape is the robe spread of the gods, which is the outspread earth itself, diversified by mountains, valleys, and bright places, which are the symbols and game marks whereby the gods themselves count up the score of their game. So this is an entirely encompassing practice and concept of gambling, not what we think of, but it has ceremonial implications, social, and economic. So I'd like to now offer some ideas about how these shed light on the Chaco phenomenon. The first has to do with social integration and the glue holding together the regional system. Why is gambling a good social integrating technique? Well, it's fun, it's addicting, it's chance-based, and it's not an assured outcome. You don't need to speak the same language. You're coming from Zuni, you're coming from Chimney Rock. You guys can throw the dice together. You don't necessarily have to speak to one another. It allows for interactions, information exchange, linkages being established between communities, networking like we're doing here. So that's one possibility. In fact, we have an entire regional system in the Southwest, the Hohokam, that we talk about being integrated together by gaming. Ball courts. So if we think of kivas as locations where gambling is happening, we've got a lot of so-called ball courts holding together the Chaco system. Now there's a supernatural element to gambling as well. Malinowski describes the gap between the predictable affairs of human life and that which is beyond our control. Take the rain this weekend, for example. Now, gambling therefore becomes linked with chance. And if you have good, what we would call luck in another worldview, that is conceptualized as divine favor. Modern gamblers today are some of the most superstitious people. And it's true because gambling encourages ritualistic behavior. Certain movements, certain prayers, you always go to the same slot. And so we talk about Chaco's ceremonial power. Well, could this power have been related to success or some kind of seeming link between bridging the unpredictability of gambling, of rainfall, that you somehow have control over these things that are unknown? Gambling also has economic implications. I truly, truly believe that many of what we call trade goods from traditional societies and, say, ancient Southwest may have in fact been acquired through gambling matches. The Hadza hunter-gatherers of Tanzania, when they gather together once a year, they redistribute goods with restricted distributions by playing a dice game, and so this maintains their egalitarian ethos that they're passing around objects. This poison arrows only come from here, and those aren't traded. They're passed along through gambling matches. So I wonder, at Chaco, could labor have eventually been wagered as described in the stories? So you lose, you go to the Chuscas and you cut down a tree and you bring it back here. And we don't have clear evidence or certainly any agreement about some sort of export coming out of Chaco Canyon. But there's vast accumulation of wealth there. Think of the Room 33 burials. Think of the amount of labor coming in. This has to be explained, and I think that gambling or offerings for gambling matches happening at the Sacred Center could be an explanation of this. Now I turn now to issues of power, prestige, and conflict. Those of you who have taken an introductory anthropology course, or others who may have just read Geertz's account of the Balinese cockfight, which is a gambling match, which is how status concerns and kinship relations are played out in a Balinese society. It's how rivalries are played out through gambling. And actually, if you study the ethnographic record, across native North America, sort of potlatch-like gambling battles in which prestige and huge amounts of wealth were wagered, gained, and lost were common. So Chaco, we have this very clear evidence of power, leadership, ranking, and we still don't know how it was acquired. Well, this is one, in my opinion, potential way that that happened.